everybody, welcome back. Thanks for joining me again if you've been here before, and if not, welcome to the first time then. Today I'm going to show you some of the ways that I utilize Topaz in my workflow. As you know, I'm into textures and doing lots of that with my work. So I'm going to do a little bit of textures, both using my own and some of the Topaz texture effects. If you haven't gotten the upgrade and you have the program, please do so because there's lots of cool new features, and it also includes some of my textures now, which is very exciting. So we're going to start working with this image. This is the finished product, and I'm going to show you how I got to this point. This was one of those images that I call truly taking ho-hum to a work of art, because it was not such a great image. This is actually my original. Let me hide these two layers. Pretty flower, not really tack sharp. It was, you know, something I was just doing walking around a town. It was handheld, a little breezy, so not a great shot, but I liked the position of it. I liked the colors of it. So the first thing I did, this was actually kind of a two-part process. I had tried editing the flower, and then I still really wasn't all that thrilled with it. But then when I started doing more texture work and, you know, Topaz texture effects, I came back to it because I still liked it and knew I could do something with this one. So the first thing I had done here was my top petal was touching the edge of the frame, which I never really like. It's either, you know, crop it good or leave a little bit of room. So I just extended my canvas, and I'm going to show you a little bit about extending canvases when we get to the end because I'm going to do a border on this one. And then, so once I did that, I decided to select my background. I'm also going to show you that in a second, and just put in a solid color. But that, I was like, yeah, okay, didn't really thrill me. And then added a little bit of grain to it, but this was as far as I took it, I don't know, probably a year or so ago. And then it just kind of sat in my folder. And then I decided to, I'm going to open up this one again, decided to do a few more things. And I think this one is a little more exciting than the other one. I hope you agree. So we're going to go back to this first one, and I'm going to take you through the steps as to where I got in that last image. So I'm going to delete these two layers because we're going to start with our true original. And we're going to do a little bit of making selections and doing some color fills, so it'll give you some tips on that if you're not familiar with those processes. So this is my first step. I'm going to select this background because what I want to do is totally delete the background. I just want a transparent background, and then I'm going to add some color to it after. So I'm going to use my magic wand tool, which is this one right up here. It has a quick selection and the magic wand. The magic wand works well when you have a fairly consistent color because it's looking for a consistency of the color when it makes that selection. If there are too many different colors, it just will select too small an image or too small an area, and then you might do better with a different selection tool. But I like to start with this one because it's quick and easy. So I have my tolerance set at 25, and that the tolerance number will also affect how many pixels it selects, so you can also play around with that when you're trying to make a selection. So let's see how this works, and I'm just going to kind of click in one of these background areas. You can see at first glance it did a fairly decent job. I'm going to hold down my Shift key, and you'll see right under my cursor the little plus sign pops up. That means as long as I hold down the Shift key, I can add to that selection. So I'm going to go ahead and try and grab a little more of this background. And that looks pretty good. And I'm also going to grab this little spot and this little spot. So that looks fairly good. Now what I find when you have something that's very light against something very dark, or sometimes you may have a sky against mountains or a building, is that right along the edges it may not always grab all of the pixels, so you would end up, in this case I might have like a darkish line around here. So the way we can kind of work around that, if we go up under our Select menu, we can modify our selection and actually expand it by a pixel or two. And in this case, I'm going to use 2 because it's a fairly large image. So what it's going to do is make this whole area come 2 pixels further in on my flower. So I make sure I grab all of that color. So I'm just going to say OK. And it's kind of imperceptible, but you could see it move just a little bit. It's kind of like right on those edges now. So what I'm going to do is I actually want to duplicate just the flower onto a new layer. So I'm going to switch the selection so that it's the flower that's selected. I'm going to do that by going back up under Select and Inverse. So now you can see the marching ants are around our flower. And sometimes it's easy to do that because it would have taken more time to select the flower itself than the background. So I just quickly selected the background and then changed it. So now my flower is selected. And a quick way we can put that on a new layer is our Control J, the letter J. If we do that when we first open our image, it will just duplicate that whole layer. But when you have a selection made and do Control J, it just copies that selection onto a separate layer. So if I turn off my background, you can see that I have my flower with transparent pixels. So now we're going to start working on the flower itself. I'm now going to duplicate that layer. Again, I'll use the Control J, and you'll see it just, now it copies the whole layer because I don't have a selection made. And the first product I'm going to use, I'm going to go up to my filter menu, come down to my Topaz, and I'm going to use Topaz Simplify. And I did play around with a few different things to get to this end result. What I was really looking to do was some kind of an outline, kind of turn it into almost drawing type of a look. So that's why I started with Simplify, because I really wasn't looking so much to keep the detail as to get some edges to it. So I ended up using Line and Ink 4. And you can see it gave me fairly decent outline, but I'm going to do some adjustments and try and bring in even a little bit more. So over under our settings, under my feature boost, I boosted that up to 2. And my detail strength, I took up to 0.20. I don't want too high, about there. And then under our edges section here, I'm going to open up this drop down. I went to, I left my edge type at monoline normal. My simplify edges I brought down to 0. Reduce weak I went down to 9.29. And again, I only know these numbers because I wrote it down when I was trying to recreate this for you. This one actually, the first time I did it, I didn't write things down, so I really did have to try and remember what I did and recreate it. I think I came pretty close. And then fattening the edges just a little bit, about there. And that looks pretty good, so I'm going to say OK. And we're going to process that and come back over to Photoshop. So now I liked the lines, but the color is way too bright. So after trying to play around with some saturations and things, and I was like, yeah, it wasn't quite giving me what I really wanted. Oh yeah, and what I also usually do is rename my layer so you remember what you did on that layer. So we're going to just put Simplify, if I can type, and then which one I used, because I didn't do that the first time and then I had to remember it. So now we're going to duplicate this again, and I'm actually going to use Topaz Black and White. And this was something I was just, again, this stuff comes about from just playing and trying some different things. Use the Stylized collection and Dynamic to Smooth. And I liked that the way it was, so I'm going to say OK. And then what I did, because I didn't want truly a black and white, was I decided to just lower the opacity of this layer down to about 42 or 3%. So I didn't do anything to the blending mode. All I did was just lower the opacity. So adding that little bit of black and white to the color kind of gave it that little bit of desaturated look, but still held some nice details in there. So now I'm going to start building my background. Now I want my background to be behind the flower, of course not in front of it. So I'm going to select my background layer because remember, anytime we add a new layer, it adds above our active layer. So I'm going to add a new blank layer, and now it's right there behind our background. And I'm going to fill this layer with color. So I'm going to actually have it here because I was practicing earlier, but we're going to select our foreground color picker. And I actually typed in the number. I had originally selected this color right out of the flower just by clicking around in here, and you can do that when you move your cursor off of the color picker. It becomes the eyedropper tool, and you can just click around until you find a color that you like. And then once I found it, I did write it down so that I could duplicate it for you. So I'm going to retype this color in and say OK. Now to fill my layer, one of the shortcuts I like to use is Alt and Backspace, and that will fill it with your foreground color. Now that was okay, it's better, right? But I wanted to give this background some texture. So what I'm going to do now is go up to the filter gallery, go filter, filter gallery, and it's popping up because it was the last one I used, but under textures, if it wasn't open, I used the texturizer, and this is the one called Sandstone, and I played around with the scaling and I liked it here, 135, the relief 8, which is the depth of the texture, and then you could choose what angle the lighting is coming from, and we're just going to say OK. So you can see if I zoom in, it gave our texture, or our background, a little bit of texture and a little more drama. Now I wanted to, jazz it up a little bit more, add a little more color to it, give it some more depth. So I actually brought in a texture of my own. So I'm going to open this up. And this was a texture that I had photographed, and then actually in an earlier webinar, I think probably the second one that I did, I showed how to modify your own textures using Topaz Impression, which is what I did on this one. So I'm going to use my Move tool. I'm going to separate this guy out, and I'm just going to grab it, drag it over, and I can close that one, and I'm just going to position this on top of our background, make it the size of my image, click OK. And then now I'm going to change the blend mode of this one to multiply. And then I'm going to bring down the opacity way down to about 20%. So it's really a subtle change. If I turn this off for a minute, there's without that texture, and here's with it. It gave a little more depth to the color, it darkened it just a little bit. I kind of like that. I thought it jazzed it up a little more. And another thing you can do if you want to add even more drama to a layer, if you double click it, you get the layer style palette, and you can do some other, using like bevel and emboss, sometimes we'll add some more depth to the type or texture or anything like that. So I'm going to use this, and it's actually on my settings already. We're going to leave it here. You can control how much of depth that you have, the sizes, soften it, angle of the lighting, and we're going to say OK. So it's just one more step. You can add a little more drama to something. So that was our finished flower. Now I decided I wanted to add a little bit of a border to it. So first I wanted to add a white border. So I'm going to turn my background on even though you can't see it and just make this my active layer. And I'm going to go up to Image, Canvas Size, and I have the relative box checked because I want to just tell it how much I want to add to the image. I don't want to have to calculate figuring out the difference in the size. So we're going to check that. It's going to be all the way around, and I'm going to add 0.10 to each. And I want it to add white at this point. And we're going to say OK. So it added a thin white border. And now I'm going to add some of that color that we had originally added in here. So we're going to do the same thing, Image, Canvas Size. This time I'm going to add 0.2. And I want it to use that foreground color that we had selected before. And I'm going to say OK. So very quickly I could add, a simple border, nothing fancy, but I think it kind of finishes off that image a little bit, especially since it was cropped over here. It kind of gives it a nice edge. So that's that image. So we went from our, where's our original? Let's do it this way. So we went from that to that. So hopefully you'll agree that that's a prettier image than the original one. So we're going to move on to our next one. And I know if you guys have any questions, type them into the box. And at the end, we will have some time for Q&As. So if there's something you're not sure of or I can repeat for you, they'll try and answer as many as we can when we get to the end. So let's close all of these guys. And we're going to move on to our next one. And this image, let's hide these other layers. This was my original in this case. This was taken on a trip last month out to Sedona, Arizona. This is actually in Jerome, the town over, a couple towns over, at a place called Ghost Town, if any of you are from that area. It's a pretty cool old place. It was an old mining town, and it has all these rusty trucks and cars and old buildings, and it's a really cool place to shoot. As you know, I like my textures, so it's a great place for shooting rusty metal. This shot was 3-shot HDR that I combined and did some other adjustments to. The one thing I noticed after I finished my HDR was I really didn't like this part of that branch right there. So I just used my clone tool and I have to be on the right layer, on the background layer here. And, went through. I'm sure most of you know how to clone, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But very quickly you can, as I'm talking, we'll just clone out this little bit of the branch. I just didn't like the way it was heading up towards that light there. So I'm going to turn this layer back on because I already had it cloned out there. And what I did on this layer was I used Topaz Detail, and then I applied a layer mask after the fact. So let's get rid of these 3, and we'll go through the steps. So I guess I have to finish my cloning, huh? So we get rid of this. Let's see if I can do this really quickly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Just give you the idea. It just made it a little better looking. I'm not going to get too fussy with it right now. You get the idea. So we're going to duplicate our layer. So Control J. And we're going to go up to our filter, Topaz Detail, which is my favorite way to sharpen these days. I think it does a great job of just really bringing out all those nice details in your images. In this case, I used Light 2, and you can see the before, and there's the after. It just really makes all those rusty things and edges really pop. But of course, I don't want to sharpen my background, so I can mask it here, but sometimes I kind of forget about that, or I'm not sure where I want to mask. So sometimes I do it while I'm in Topaz, right in the program, and sometimes I will do it back in Photoshop. So I'm going to say OK, add a layer mask, and just using a soft brush. Where's my paintbrush? Need the right one. There we go. Oop, that's a little too big. My foreground color is black, so I'm just going to quickly mask that away. I'm not going to get too particular right now. We're just, you get the idea. Okay, so you can see the black area where I just painted, and that gets rid of the sharpening. So we'll name that Detail Light 2. And we're going to do a Control-J and duplicate that layer again, except I don't want the layer mask on this one. And now we're going to go into texture effects. So filter Topaz, go all the way down to our texture effects 2. And let's close this guy. This is the last one I used. Let's move that out of the way. And we're going to use in the vintage collection, I'm going to come down to the one I ended up liking, is this Rustic Farm. And I thought it just gave it more of that old grungy look and not, dulled the colors down a little bit. I really like that a lot. But then I said, well, as I usually do, what else can I do? So I decided to add another texture. So I'm going to click on my Add Adjustment, and I chose the textures. And I actually selected one of mine that is in here. Now you can add your own textures, as you probably already know. You can import your own textures and add them to texture effects as well. And I decided to use this kind of rusty metal one. And I changed my blending mode from normal to linear burn. And then lowered the opacity to 0.25 or thereabouts. Now here I did decide to mask the texture off of the headlight. So I'm going to come down here. I want to say yes, I want to enable masking. And I want to go to the brush. And I decided to use a radius of 1. So we're going to go all the way up. Strength 0.7, which is like an opacity. And then the hardness, I wanted a harder edge since it's a finite edge to the subject. And this size fits right over it, so I'm just going to click once, twice, and you can see there's where I just masked, and it's not a solid black, so there's a little bit of texture left there, but it took away most of the texture just because I really wanted that light to kind of stand out. And we'll say OK. And there's our finished image. So we went from that, which is very bright after I did the HDR. It brought out lots of color, which it was, that color, but that's a little bright. So I thought this really gave it that more grungy look that I was going for with that nice old rusty truck. So that completes that image. Let's close this guy. And the next one I call the chair. So I'm going to show you first my kind of original finished image that I posted on Facebook and I think is in the promo for this webinar. And the more I looked at this one, the one thing that I didn't like in the finished image was this kind of cardboardy thing, I guess, that was leaning against the window. This was an old abandoned factory I was at a couple months ago with a group. It's in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's the old Scranton Lace Factory. And so I decided when I would do this final one, I decided to clone that out. So here's my final, and I think it looks a lot better without that there because it just kept drawing my eye to that area, and I really want people to focus on the chair. So we're going to go back over to here and we'll go through these steps. So let's get to trying to get this little, I don't want to lose you, so I don't want to close it all the way. As in my last webinar, if you were listening to me, I accidentally closed out a little too soon and didn't get to say goodbye to everybody, so I don't want to do that this time. So we're going to delete these layers first. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to show you what I did to this image first. Ooh, forgot this one. All right, so let's delete that one as well. We don't want black and white. Okay, so here is my original. And you can see that the edge of my window and the walls are not quite squared up. So I did duplicated that and used the skew command to kind of straighten these out a little bit, which you find up under Edit, Transform, and Skew. And that lets you, pull the corners out so you can kind of straighten things, especially buildings when you get that, the perspective. And you can see I cloned away that annoying little cardboard thing there. So now we're going to go ahead and start our processing. So let's get to the right notes here. Alrighty, so we did that. Let's do our Control-J, duplicate our layer, and we are going to first use denoise. So one thing that happens sometimes with our HDR, if you look in here, is we get a lot of noise. So let's go to our filter, Topaz, denoise, which does a great job of getting rid of this. And even though I shot this image in RAW, it is 3 shots merged. So I found when I was trying some different settings that the RAW ones weren't really working as well as the JPEG ones did. So I ended up going with JPEG moderate, because we want to get rid of the noise, but I don't want to get rid of so much that my image becomes soft all over. So I kind of compromised here, and I thought this got rid of enough without it, really softening up my image. So it's like when we're sharpening an image, it's that fine line. You don't want to over sharpen and cause noise, but you don't want to, get rid of so much that it becomes too soft looking. So I thought that was a good compromise there. So that's our denoise. So I'm going to duplicate that one again. And then I wanted to go into texture effects. Texture effects 2 and filter, texture effects. And this one, I went back up to the soft grunge section and found Mauve Fog. And I really liked the way that looked and worked with the colors. So I kept that as is, and we're just going to apply that one. And you can see, here's my before. And this really, it brightened up some areas and darkened others that I thought really brought out the drama in the walls and in the chair. And then I decided to add one more texture, and this one is one that I also photographed. So we're going to open this up, go to our Move tool. I'm going to bring this one over, and this is just an old peeling paint on a wall at another place that I shot at before. So this one is actually much larger. We're just going to bring this down to the size of our image. Usually I try and size things pretty consistently, but the original images we're working with I did size down a little for the webinar so they would open quicker. So we're going to say OK. And this one I decided I wanted the texture of the image but not the color. So I'm going to add a hue and saturation adjustment, And I'm going to clip this adjustment to this layer so that it only affects this layer, because if I take my saturation down now, it's going to actually take down the saturation of everything, which is not what I wanted to do. So by doing Control-Alt-G, it groups this layer. See that little arrow that now points down? It's only affecting this layer and not anything else underneath. It's still all color. So now that we've made this a black and white, I've decided to change the blending mode to soft light, and then I brought down my opacity about 70%, somewhere around there. So you can see before the layer, we'll turn that off again. So there was our before, and then with the texture, but see, I didn't like that color, so that was when I decided to do the black and white to just give me the texture of the texture, but not the color of the texture. So that's something good to keep in mind as you're working with textures, whether it's in texture effects or your own textures or even ones that you may download. You can always change the colors with a hue and saturation, but you can also just desaturate it and get just the effect of the texture. So I was much happier with this now without that little board there, and I thought that was a pretty good effort for that one. So let's go ahead and close this one. And okay, we're doing pretty good on time. A couple more I want to show you. So I'm going to actually do one more from the same day's shoot as that one was. And this was another chair, and why this was in an old abandoned factory, I don't know. But it made for a very cool photograph. And again, this one was an HDR image. This is 3 shots. So I'm going to delete all of these layers, and I'm going to show you what we did here. Let's get rid of those. We're going to duplicate our background. So again, this one I did the denoise on again. This one it didn't seem quite as noisy because there's more of a pattern over here on the wall. It doesn't stand out so much, but we're going to go ahead and do that anyway. So denoise. And I stayed with that JPEG moderate. And you can see it does get rid of some over here. There's the before with some of the spots in there. I'll move that over. And there's the after. It smooths it out a little bit. So it did do a good job. And we'll say OK. And again, you can go in and fine-tune it as much as you wish on your images. So after that, now I actually wanted to do a little bit of detail to bring out some of the details, especially in this fabric. So again, we don't want to use so much detail that it brings back noise, but we're going to walk that fine line here. And detail 3. And I tend to like the creative collection with just the overall details of light 1, light 2. Those quite often work very well. So here we can see if I click on here, there's my before. You can see it's slightly soft in there, and there without it, it just really makes the details in the brick pop without bringing back any noise, and really makes the detail in the fabric pop. So we're going to say OK. Now this one I was pretty happy with as it was, but I really wanted to focus the eye on this chair. So I wanted to darken the edges. And a quick way to do a vignette, and you can do this in a lot of the Topaz products, but again, sometimes you don't think about it when you're in like Topaz effects or something like that. So there is an easy way you can add a vignette yourself to your image. So I'm going to just add a blank layer above everything, and I'm going to select my default. I want to fill this layer with black. So like we did before, I'm going to use the Alt backspace, and I'm going to just fill that layer with the black that we have here. And I use my oval marquee tool, And I'm going to start way up here in the corner, and I'm going to click, hold, and just drag it all the way down to this corner. Now the lines will pop up to show you that you're perfectly centered, but as long as we get pretty close, it's going to be okay. Then I'm going to let go. So now if I deleted the center of this circle right now, we would have a very hard edge there, which we want a very soft edge. So we're going to go up under our Select tool, go to Modify, and we're going to feather that selection. And because I know this is a pretty large image, I'm going to do 200 because I did downsize it a little. Usually I do 250. I tend to save my images about 15 inches large. So this one I know I downsized a little bit for today. So I'm going to say OK. And then you're going to see how it changes the shape of that circle as you, change that feathering. And now I'm just going to hit the delete key on my keyboard, and it's going to delete the center of that circle or oval. And Control D will deselect that, or you could go up under Select and deselect. So now you can see I've just, in here on the layer you can see it, created a vignette. Now that's a little too dark, so we're just going to reduce the opacity until it's where we like it. And I think I went at about, way down to about 50% or so. So you can see there's the before, very bright on the edges because the light was coming right in this window. And it's almost imperceptible when you see it without having seen the before, but it's just enough to focus your viewer's eye on your subject and just give it that subtle change around the edges. Alrighty, so, oops, I just dropped my notes. Hang on one second. Alrighty. So we're going to go ahead and close this one. And we're not going to save it. And we're going to open one that I called Silk Thread. And we're going to, this is my original. This was one that was taken indoors at in a museum, and I did not have my tripod with me, so I was hand holding and the lighting was not really bright, so it's a little bit on the soft side, but I still liked the image, and I decided I wanted to play around with it and see what I could do by adding some textures, of course, and some other things. So we're going to get started with this one. And let's delete these. And then we'll duplicate our background layer. And the first thing I'm going to do is one of my, I think it was the first Topaz program I ever had, and that's Topaz Adjust. I had seen this used years ago when I was at our New England photography conference by Tony Sweet, and I just thought it was the greatest thing in the world. He was doing some awesome stuff with it. And in fact, one of his favorite presets was Spicify. And it's kind of almost like a pseudo HDR. Sometimes it goes a little over the top, but sometimes it really can bring out some great drama in a shot. So I used this, and I did a little bit of adjusting over here. So under my details, let's see, I wanted to change my protect highlights to 0.07, and the protect shadows I brought up to 6. So I didn't really need to do anything there. So just added a little adjustment in there, and we'll say OK. And you can see from our before, that's kind of a little on the soft side, really brings out all the drama and detail in the threads and in the spool. I did do some cloning in the background because there were some distracting things back there. So we should rename this one. Oops, not detail. Adjust. Spicify. And then we're going to copy this one. And now we're going to go into our Topaz texture effects. And this one, all I wanted to do was I wanted to add a border. I didn't really want to add any texture to this one. So I'm just going to click on the new, and I'm going to just make a selection here to add something, and I wanted to add some borders. I wanted to give it that kind of faded look on the edges, and I actually came down to this one. Now it doesn't really show up because it's green, but when I changed the blending mode from multiply to luminosity, it became white instead of green. And then I lowered my opacity to about 47%, and I thought that was pretty cool. So we're going to say OK. And then when you get back here, if you think that's still maybe a little too much, we could always further lower the opacity of the layer and kind of bring it back just a little bit. Then you could rename this to E2 and just put border. And that would do it. So that would be the finished one for that image. And I have one more I'm going to quickly show you. Let's close this guy. So what I'm trying to show you tonight is just that you can, not only think about using one of the Topaz, items, but, whether it's textures or detail or this, but think about combining them, and you can do some really cool stuff when you just, I always say get in there and play, and that's really what we're doing, and you never know what you come up with until you try some different things. And the more you do it, the more you'll get a feel for what you think it might look like, or what you're, in your mind's eye, what you're seeing and what you're trying to accomplish. So this is another one. It was actually also from Scranton Lace. There was an old piano there. And this is my background. It was another HDR, so it was a couple of merged shots. And let's get rid of these two, and I'll show you what we did. So Control J. First, this one I used clarity. So we're going to go into here, and I just wanted to, again, bring out some more of the details, sharpen it up a little bit. I actually ended up liking one in the landscape mode. So even though there are different groupings, you don't always have to think about, okay, well, this is, a nature shot. I can only use what's in nature. Sometimes you can, try something else, and it may work better for your particular image. And I went into Landscape Pop 1. So you can see when I hit let's get rid of that little guy. There's my before, and then there's our after. There it is. Wasn't working. There's my before, and a little delay here, waiting for the after to pop up. So you can see it really brought out some of the texture in those keys and some more detail and everything. So we'll say OK. And I'm going to copy this one more time. And then I went into Texture Effects. And I'm actually using, let's reset this, close that. In our soft grunge, the one I used earlier, that mauve fog really worked here as well. And then I also added another texture. So we're going to go in here. It's actually another one of mine. 1, 2, 3. This brown one. And I changed this I brought the brightness to -0.22. And the contrast down some. And the saturation down a little bit. And then I changed the blending mode to multiply, which is one of the darkening modes, and then lower the opacity a little bit. And we'll say OK. So you can see here before I added Topaz textures, it had a kind of a cooler tone to the colors. So with this one, it warmed it up and gave it a nice finish. And that's our final image.
Fantastic. That was a great job. It's going to be hard to find
Thank you.
questions with all the feedback. And
Congrats.
always, if you'd like to follow Hazel, I know a lot of people had questions. You can reach out to her through her website at meredithimages.com. You can also follow her. Be sure to follow her. All those follows help a lot. Follow her at facebook.com/meredithimages. If you have questions, you can contact us at webinars@topazlabs.com. And you can also register for upcoming webinars at topazlabs.com/webinars.
And I always welcome questions if anybody has, further things that we couldn't get to today. If you want to know how something was done again, feel free to email me. I love hearing from everybody.
Yeah, she really likes the feedback, and she always has some great tips. Love having you.
Well,
And look
thanks,
forward to having you in
everybody.
the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.